March 17th, 1956, 10:34 a.m. WNYC radio studios on West 44th Street in Manhattan, broadcasting from a fifth-floor studio that overlooked Times Square and that had been home to The Richard Morrison Show since 1952, a morning talk program that combined news commentary, celebrity interviews, and discussions about New York City culture, with an audience that reached approximately 200,000 listeners across the tri-state area during weekday broadcasts. The studio itself measured approximately 20 feet by 15 feet, with soundproof walls covered in acoustic foam, a control booth separated by glass where engineers monitored audio levels and managed commercial breaks, and a table positioned in the center where host and guests sat facing microphones suspended from adjustable arms. Richard Morrison, age 43, had been hosting his eponymous radio show for 8 years, building a reputation as someone who asked provocative questions and who wasn't afraid to challenge guests regardless of their status or influence. His interview style combined intelligence. He'd graduated from Columbia University with a degree in journalism, with a willingness to create controversy that generated listener interest and that made his show profitable for advertisers who valued the large audience his provocative approach attracted. Morrison's guests had included politicians, entertainers, business leaders, and occasionally figures from New York's criminal underworld, who Morrison believed provided insight into aspects of city life that polite society preferred to ignore, but that listeners found fascinating. Bumpy Johnson arrived at WNYC Studios at 10:17 a.m., accompanied by Marcus Webb, his most trusted lieutenant, who would wait in the building's lobby during the interview because station policy prohibited anyone except scheduled guests and staff from entering the broadcast areas. Bumpy had agreed to this interview 3 weeks earlier after Morrison's producer had contacted him through intermediaries explaining that Morrison wanted to discuss the real power structures in Harlem and the role of community leaders who operate outside traditional political channels. The framing had suggested an interview that would treat Bumpy as a legitimate figure deserving serious discussion rather than as a criminal to be condemned, and Bumpy had calculated that the platform could be valuable for presenting his perspective to an audience that typically received information about Harlem only through mainstream media that portrayed black neighborhoods as problems requiring white solutions. The interview began at 10:34 a.m., following 3 minutes of commercial advertisements that Morrison's show used to separate segments and that provided revenue from sponsors, including Rheingold Beer, Chesterfield Cigarettes, and Neddick's Restaurants, businesses that targeted working-class New Yorkers who constituted Morrison's primary demographic. Morrison's introduction at 10:37 a.m. established the framework for what would follow, delivered in a tone that combined journalistic seriousness with an undertone suggesting the interview would be confrontational rather than respectful. Good morning, listeners. Today, we're joined by a man who needs no introduction to anyone familiar with Harlem's streets, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, known to law enforcement as one of New York's most successful criminals, and known to Harlem residents as something between a community leader and a neighborhood boss. Mr. Johnson, thank you for joining us today, despite what I'm sure are numerous other obligations that compete for your attention. The introduction contained multiple implications that experienced listeners would recognize as setting a hostile tone, describing Bumpy as a successful criminal rather than using more neutral language, suggesting that his obligations were criminal operations rather than legitimate business, and framing his presence as surprising, given that respectable people wouldn't typically appear on radio programs to discuss illegal activities. Bumpy's response at 10:38 a.m. maintained composure that reflected decades of experience navigating situations where white authority figures attempted to establish dominance through language and framing. Thank you for having me, Mr. Morrison. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss Harlem and the community I've been part of for nearly 40 years. The first 10 minutes of the interview proceeded relatively smoothly, with Morrison asking questions about Harlem's history, about changes the neighborhood had experienced since the Great Migration brought Black Americans from the South to northern cities, and about Bumpy's perspective on race relations in New York during the 1950s. Bumpy's answers were thoughtful and articulate, describing Harlem as a community that had created its own institutions and leaders because mainstream American society had excluded black people from full participation in economic and political systems that determined resource allocation and opportunity distribution. Several listeners who later provided testimony about what they'd heard would note that the first 10 minutes suggested the interview might be substantive rather than sensationalistic. The tone shifted at 10:48 a.m. when Morrison moved from questions about community to questions about Bumpy's personal operations, and specifically about allegations that Bumpy controlled illegal gambling through numbers rackets that extracted money from Harlem residents who could ill afford to gamble. Morrison's question at 10:17 a.m. contained language that witnesses later identified as the beginning of the disrespect that would define the interview's second half. Mr. Johnson, let's talk about how you actually make your money. You run numbers operations that convince poor Negroes to gamble their wages on bets they'll almost certainly lose. You're essentially exploiting your own people, taking advantage of their lack of education and their desperate hope that gambling might provide the financial security that legitimate work can't offer. How do you justify that? How do you sleep at night knowing that you're profiting from the suffering of the very community you claim to serve? The question contained several provocations: the use of Negroes rather than black people or African Americans, the characterization of gambling as exploitation rather than as a choice people made voluntarily, and the implication that Bumpy was betraying his community rather than providing services that community members valued. Bumpy's response at 10:49 a.m. maintained the same composure he'd shown throughout the interview, refusing to accept Morrison's framing while addressing the substance of the question. Mr. Morrison, the numbers operations in Harlem exist because legitimate economic opportunities are limited for black Americans, regardless of our education or abilities. Banks won't provide loans to black business owners. Companies won't hire black workers for positions beyond manual labor. The numbers provide entertainment, employment, and occasionally, winnings that change people's lives. I don't apologize for operating in an economy that white America created by excluding us from legitimate participation. Morrison's response at 10:47 a.m. escalated the confrontation in ways that crossed lines of professional conduct and racial respect that should have governed broadcast journalism even in 1956 when civil rights movements were gaining momentum, but when casual racism remained common in mainstream media. Morrison's voice carried a tone that combined condescension and hostility as he delivered words that would be repeated in newspapers and discussed in congressional hearings about broadcast standards. Mr. Johnson, that's a convenient excuse, isn't it? Blame white America for your choice to be a criminal. But let's be honest about what you are. You're a thug. You're a gangster. You're exactly the kind of Negro who gives the entire race a bad reputation with respectable Americans who might otherwise support civil rights if they didn't have to worry about people like you making their neighborhoods unsafe. The use of thug, gangster, and especially that kind of Negro, delivered on live radio to 200,000 listeners, represented not just professional misconduct, but racial animus that violated broadcasting standards about maintaining civility regardless of guests' backgrounds. The control booth engineer later testified that he'd considered cutting to commercial break immediately, but had hesitated because Morrison was the show's host and had authority over content decisions that engineers typically didn't override without explicit instructions from station management. What happened at 10:23 a.m. would be described in dozens of witness statements, would be analyzed by broadcasting professionals trying to understand what had occurred, and would become legendary in Harlem as an example of Bumpy Johnson's power extending into realms where most criminals had no influence. Instead of responding with anger, instead of walking out of the interview, instead of threatening Morrison verbally or physically, Bumpy did something that Morrison apparently hadn't anticipated, and that witnesses later described as more terrifying than any threat could have been. Bumpy smiled. Not a nervous smile, not an attempt to diffuse tension through humor, but a slow, deliberate smile that began at 10:23 a.m. and reached full expression by 10:29 a.m., 6 seconds during which Bumpy's face transformed from composed neutrality to an expression that communicated understanding, certainty, and something that Morrison later described in private conversations as the look of someone who knows exactly what's about to happen and is completely comfortable with the consequences. The smile lasted approximately 4 seconds before Bumpy spoke at 10:33 a.m., his voice maintaining the same calm tone he'd used throughout the interview, despite having just been called a thug and blamed for damaging his racist reputation. Mr. Morrison, I appreciate you sharing your honest opinion about what kind of Negro you think I am. I think it's important for your listeners to hear exactly what you believe about black people in general and about me specifically. Please, continue. I'm very interested in hearing more about your views on race and criminality and which Negros you consider respectable enough to deserve civil rights. The response was perfect in ways that Morrison apparently didn't recognize immediately. Bumpy had invited Morrison to continue expressing racist views on live radio, had framed Morrison's comments as representative of Morrison's broader attitudes about race, and had done so while maintaining a tone of polite interest that made clear Bumpy wasn't intimidated or offended, but was instead observing Morrison make a mistake whose consequences hadn't yet become apparent. Morrison attempted to recover at 10:51 a.m., apparently recognizing that Bumpy's response had reframed the conversation in ways that made Morrison, rather than Bumpy, appear to be on the defensive. Mr. Johnson, I'm not here to discuss my views on race. I'm here to interview you about your criminal activities and their impact on Harlem. Let's get back to... But Bumpy interrupted at 10:51:17 a.m., the first time he'd interrupted Morrison during the interview, delivering words that would be quoted in newspapers, covering the aftermath. No, Mr. Morrison, let's stay exactly where we are. You just called me a thug and a gangster and said I'm the kind of Negro who makes white America uncomfortable with civil rights. Those are strong statements to make on live radio. I think your listeners deserve to hear you explain exactly what you meant. What kind of Negro should I be to earn your respect? What kind of Negro deserves civil rights in your opinion? I'm genuinely curious. The tables had turned at 10:51:34 a.m. in ways that created a situation Morrison hadn't prepared for. Bumpy had transformed from interview subject to interviewer, had forced Morrison to defend statements that sounded much worse when repeated back and examined critically, and had done all of this while smiling in a way that suggested he was completely relaxed despite being in a hostile environment. Morrison's response at 10:51:47 a.m. revealed discomfort that listeners could hear in his voice. Mr. Johnson, you're twisting my words. I never said. You said exactly what I quoted, Bumpy interrupted again at 10:51:53 a.m. Your listeners heard it, I heard it, your engineers recorded it, so let's not pretend you didn't say what we all know you said. The question now is whether you're willing to defend what you said, or whether you're going to pretend you meant something different than what your words clearly communicated. The smile remained throughout this exchange, and Morrison later told colleagues that the smile was what made the situation feel dangerous rather than just uncomfortable. Bumpy wasn't angry, wasn't defensive, wasn't showing any of the reactions Morrison had expected from someone who'd been insulted on live radio. Instead, Bumpy appeared to be enjoying watching Morrison squirm, appeared to be completely confident that this confrontation would end in Bumpy's favor, regardless of how Morrison responded. At 10:52 a.m., 2 minutes before the show would be cancelled while still on air, Morrison made a decision that would ensure his career's destruction was complete rather than partial. Instead of apologizing, instead of moving to commercial break, instead of any response that might have salvaged the situation, Morrison doubled down with words that sealed his fate. Fine, Mr. Johnson. You want honesty? Here's honesty. I think you're a criminal who preys on your own people. I think Harlem would be better off without people like you. And I think respectable Negros, the kind who work legitimate jobs and raise families and contribute to society, probably wish you'd disappear so that white America wouldn't associate all black people with gangsters like you. Bumpy's smile widened at 10:52:34 a.m. What Richard Morrison didn't understand, at 10:52:34 a.m., when Bumpy's smile widened in response to Morrison's declaration that Harlem would be better off without people like Bumpy, was that the smile wasn't a response to what Morrison had just said. The smile was acknowledgement of what was already happening in ways Morrison couldn't observe from the radio studio, but that would become apparent within the next 2 minutes. The smile was Bumpy's recognition that Morrison had committed professional suicide on live radio, and that the wheels of consequence were already turning in ways that would destroy Morrison's career before the interview concluded. What Morrison also didn't know, what he couldn't have known unless he'd understood how Bumpy operated and how Bumpy's influence extended far beyond Harlem streets into boardrooms and business relationships that connected New York's criminal underworld to its legitimate economy, was that Bumpy hadn't come to the interview alone in the sense that mattered. Marcus Webb was waiting in the building's lobby, yes, but Marcus wasn't just waiting passively. He was listening to the interview through a portable radio, monitoring what Morrison was saying, and most importantly, he was ready to execute a plan that Bumpy had developed 3 weeks earlier when he'd first agreed to appear on Morrison's show. The plan had been simple but comprehensive. Marcus would listen to the interview from the lobby. If Morrison maintained respect and conducted a fair interview, nothing would happen beyond the interview itself concluding normally. But if Morrison revealed himself to be what Bumpy suspected he was, a racist who would use the platform of live radio to insult and demean a black guest, then Marcus would execute a series of phone calls that would demonstrate to Morrison and to New York's broadcasting industry that disrespecting Bumpy Johnson carried costs that extended beyond street violence into realms where reputation and revenue determined survival. The first call was made at 10:34 a.m., 11 seconds after Bumpy's initial smile, when Marcus Webb picked up a payphone in the WNYC building's lobby and dialed a number that connected him to Julius Stein, owner of Stein's department store on 125th Street and one of Harlem's most successful black business owners. The conversation lasted 23 seconds and consisted of Marcus saying, "Mr. Stein, this is Marcus Webb calling for Mr. Johnson. The radio situation is what we discussed. Your move now." Julius Stein's response was immediate. "Understood. Consider it done." Stein hung up and immediately called Rheingold Brewery's advertising department to inform them that Stein's department store, which purchased approximately $50,000 per year in Rheingold products for resale, would discontinue all Rheingold purchases if the brewery continued sponsoring Richard Morrison's radio show. The second call was made at 10:51 a.m. when Marcus dialed Abraham Cohen, owner of Cohen's Furniture on Lenox Avenue, and another businessman whose operations depended partly on relationships with Bumpy's network. The conversation was nearly identical. "Mr. Cohen, this is Marcus Webb. The radio situation requires your action now." Cohen's response matched Stein's. "I understand. Calling now." Cohen contacted Chesterfield Cigarettes' regional sales office to inform them that Cohen's Furniture, which sold cigarettes alongside furniture and which purchased approximately $30,000 annually in Chesterfield products, would immediately switch to competing brands if Chesterfield continued advertising on Morrison's show. The third call was made at 10:51:11 a.m. to Samuel Rodriguez, who owned 3 Nedix restaurant franchises in Harlem and whose businesses generated approximately $75,000 annually in revenue that made him one of Nedix's most valuable franchise operators in New York City. The message was identical. Rodriguez's response was immediate. He called Nedix corporate headquarters to inform them that his franchises would begin promoting competing restaurant chains if Nedix continued sponsoring a radio host who just insulted Harlem's community on live broadcast. These 3 calls, executed in 37 seconds across 3 separate business owners who'd agreed weeks earlier to participate in Bumpy's contingency plan, triggered a cascade of consequences that would reach Morrison's sponsors before Morrison finished his attack on Bumpy. Each of the 3 business owners represented significant revenue for the sponsors they threatened to boycott. More importantly, each represented connections to Harlem's black consumer market that white-owned companies had only recently begun recognizing as valuable. The threat of losing access to that market, delivered simultaneously by three respected business owners, was sufficient to generate immediate panic among advertising executives who understood that consumer boycotts could cost far more than radio advertising could ever generate in sales. At 10:52:47 a.m., 13 seconds after Bumpy's smile had widened in response to Morrison's doubled-down attack, the first consequence reached the radio studio. A light began flashing on the control booth's main console, a signal that meant the station manager was calling from his office on the building's 4th floor. The engineer monitoring the broadcast picked up the internal phone at 10:52:53 a.m. and listened for approximately 8 seconds before his expression shifted from routine attention to shocked disbelief. The conversation was later reconstructed through engineer testimony. Station manager Harold Brewster had received 3 phone calls in the past 2 minutes from advertising executives representing Rheingold, Chesterfield, and Neddix, all of whom were demanding immediate cessation of Morrison's show or threatening to pull all advertising from WNYC across all programs, not just Morrison's show. The engineer attempted to signal Morrison at 10:53:01 a.m. by holding up a hand through the control booth glass and mouthing words that Morrison couldn't interpret because Morrison was focused on continuing his attack on Bumpy rather than monitoring the engineer for signals. The engineer later testified that he'd tried to communicate "end it now" through gestures, but that Morrison had either not understood or had chosen to ignore the signals because Morrison continued speaking at 10:53:07 a.m. with words that made the situation worse rather than better. "Mr. Johnson, that smile doesn't intimidate me. I've interviewed criminals before. I've dealt with people far more dangerous than a Harlem numbers runner who thinks he's important because..." The broadcast ended at 10:53:47 a.m. Not because Morrison stopped speaking, not because the interview concluded naturally, not because a scheduled commercial break had arrived. The broadcast ended because station manager Harold Brewster had made a decision that virtually never occurred in radio broadcasting. He'd ordered the engineer to cut the live feed immediately, to switch to pre-recorded programming, and to get Morrison out of the studio before he could do additional damage to WNYC's relationship with sponsors who'd just threatened to withdraw hundreds of thousands of dollars in annual advertising revenue. The silence that filled the studio at 10:53:48 a.m. was absolute and shocking in ways that anyone who'd been listening to the interview would recognize as abnormal. Radio broadcasts don't simply stop mid-sentence. They transition smoothly to commercials or to other programming through announcements that maintain the illusion of planned scheduling. But Morrison's show had been cut so abruptly that listeners heard Morrison's sentence interrupted mid-word, followed by 3 seconds of dead air, followed by a pre-recorded jazz program that began playing without introduction or explanation. Morrison's expression at 10:53:51 a.m. revealed that he'd understood something catastrophic had happened, but that he didn't yet comprehend the scope or permanence of the consequences. He looked at Bumpy, then at the microphone, then at the control booth where the engineer was gesturing frantically for Morrison to remove his headphones. Bumpy remained seated, his smile still present, watching Morrison process what had occurred with an expression that communicated complete understanding of every element of the situation and absolute certainty about how this would conclude. Station manager Brewster entered the studio at 10:54:03 a.m., moving quickly but not running, his face showing the kind of controlled anger that comes from professional emergencies, where appearing composed is essential even when internal panic is overwhelming. His words to Morrison were delivered quietly enough that Bumpy had to strain slightly to hear them from across the table. "Richard, we need to talk in my office immediately. The show has been cancelled. Not just today's broadcast, the entire show, permanently. I've been instructed by station ownership to inform you that your services are no longer required and that you should collect your personal belongings and leave the building within the hour." Morrison's response at 10:54:17 a.m. was exactly what Bumpy would have predicted for someone whose world had just collapsed in ways they hadn't anticipated. Denial followed by desperate attempts to understand what had happened. "Harold, what are you talking about? Cancelled? The show has been on air for 8 years. We're the highest rated morning program in New York. You can't just..." "I can and I have," Brewster interrupted at 10:54:23 a.m. 3 major sponsors called in the last 3 minutes, threatening to pull all advertising from WNYC if we continued broadcasting your interview. That's approximately $300,000 in annual revenue that we cannot afford to lose. Station ownership made the decision immediately. "You're done, Richard, effective immediately." Morrison turned to look at Bumpy at 10:54:34 a.m., his expression showing recognition that the smile had meant something Morrison hadn't understood when it appeared. "You did this. You made those calls. You threatened the sponsors somehow." Bumpy's response at 10:54:41 a.m. was delivered in the same calm tone he'd maintained throughout the interview, his smile still present, but his words chosen carefully to ensure that Morrison understood exactly what had happened without Bumpy explicitly claiming responsibility for actions that technically hadn't required his direct involvement. "Mr. Morrison, I didn't make any calls. I've been sitting here with you for the past 20 minutes, as you and your engineers and Mr. Brewster can all confirm, but I will say this. Harlem is a community. When someone disrespects that community on live radio using the kind of language you used, the community responds. Business owners who serve Harlem's residents make decisions about which companies they'll support and which companies they'll boycott. That's not a threat. That's just how communities protect themselves when people with platforms abuse those platforms to spread racism. The explanation was perfect because it was technically true, while omitting the crucial detail that the community response had been orchestrated by Bumpy weeks in advance as a contingency plan that would only be activated if Morrison revealed himself to be exactly what Bumpy had suspected. Morrison couldn't prove that Bumpy had arranged anything. The business owners who'd called sponsors had made independent decisions to protest Morrison's comments, decisions that happened to occur simultaneously, and that happened to target all three major sponsors within a 3-minute window. But that were technically separate actions by separate individuals who could honestly claim they were responding to Morrison's on-air racism. Bumpy stood at 10:55:04 a.m., straightened his jacket, and extended his hand toward Morrison in a gesture that seemed almost generous given what had just occurred. "Thank you for the opportunity to appear on your show, Mr. Morrison. I hope you learned something valuable about the importance of respecting all your guests regardless of their backgrounds. I think this interview demonstrated some important lessons about consequences." Morrison didn't shake Bumpy's hand. He sat in his chair, looking at the microphone that was no longer broadcasting his voice, at the control booth, where engineers were already switching equipment to different programs, at station manager Brewster, who was waiting for Morrison to leave so that damage control could begin. Bumpy withdrew his hand at 10:55:17 a.m., nodded politely to Brewster, and walked out of the studio with the same dignified composure he'd maintained throughout the interview. Marcus Webb was waiting in the lobby at 10:56 a.m. when Bumpy exited the elevators. His first words were a question that he already knew the answer to, but asked anyway to confirm the plan had executed successfully. "How did it go?" Bumpy's smile, the same smile that had appeared when Morrison first insulted him, was his initial response before he spoke at 10:56:11 a.m. "Exactly as we planned. The show was cancelled while we were still on air. Morrison's career is finished. And we didn't have to threaten anyone or break any laws. We just reminded some business owners that they have choices about who they support, and they made those choices independently." The aftermath of March 17, 1956 would extend far beyond Richard Morrison's cancelled radio show. Within 24 hours, every radio and television station in New York had heard about what happened, not through Bumpy or his associates spreading the story, but through broadcasting industry networks where news of a show being cancelled, mid-broadcast, traveled quickly and generated intense curiosity about what had caused such an extraordinary response. Within 48 hours, Morrison's name had been added to informal blacklists maintained by station managers who understood that hiring someone who'd triggered sponsor boycotts was too risky, regardless of that person's previous success or ratings. Morrison applied for positions at 17 different radio stations over the next 6 months. None offered him employment. He attempted to start an independent podcast-style recorded program that he could distribute to stations, but no station was willing to purchase content from someone associated with sponsor boycotts and racial controversy. By September 1956, Morrison had left broadcasting entirely and taken a position as a public relations consultant for a small manufacturing company in New Jersey, a position that paid less than a quarter of what he'd earned as a radio host, and that offered none of the prestige or influence he'd enjoyed during his 8-year run on WNYC. Bumpy Johnson never publicly claimed responsibility for Morrison's career destruction, never admitted that he'd orchestrated the sponsor boycotts, and never confirmed that the smile had been a signal to Marcus Webb to execute the contingency plan. But everyone in Harlem understood what had happened. Everyone in New York's broadcasting industry understood what had happened. And most importantly, everyone who might have considered disrespecting Bumpy in similar ways understood that doing so carried consequences that extended beyond physical violence into realms where reputation and career could be destroyed through perfectly legal actions that required no threats and left no evidence of criminal conspiracy. The recording of Morrison's interview with Bumpy was never broadcast again and was reportedly destroyed by WNYC management to prevent future controversy. But dozens of listeners had recorded the broadcast on home recording equipment, and those recordings circulated through Harlem for years afterward, particularly the moment at 10:23 a.m. when Bumpy smiled in response to Morrison's insults. A smile that everyone who heard the recording understood wasn't submission or nervousness, but was recognition that Morrison had just destroyed himself without understanding that consequences were already in motion. The legend of Bumpy's smile became part of Harlem folklore, repeated whenever someone asked how Bumpy maintained power, not just through violence, but through connections and strategic thinking that extended into legitimate business and media. The story always ended the same way. Bumpy smiled, and 2 minutes later, a man's career ended. Not because Bumpy threatened anyone, not because Bumpy broke any laws, but because Bumpy understood that power comes in many forms, and sometimes the most devastating response to disrespect isn't violence. It's demonstrating that your influence extends into places your enemies didn't realize you could reach.